to welcome those who are here and coming in to this panel that I'm very excited about on studying aging in minoritized populations, the value of lived experiences from community to biomarkers. Sponsored by the new University of Texas Center on Aging and Population Sciences and funded by the National Institute on Aging. I want to thank Deb Umberson, who is the director, and Karen Fingerman, who's the research director, for the idea to put a panel together, and Stacy Brody for doing all the organization on it. I'm Chandra Muller, and my first order of business is to thank Jen Manley for generously thinking through the idea for this panel with me. I alone, however, will take credit for anything that's messed up. The idea goes to her, though. The panel consists of 3 extraordinary speakers who will each share their unique perspectives and insights. Each directs studies to investigate aging of minoritized populations within communities and does much more for the field as well. The panel will be moderated by Justina Avila-Rieger. Each panelist will talk for about 20 or 25 minutes. We'll hear a few thoughts from Justina and then open it up for questions and discussions. People in the audience should feel free to put questions into the chat. We'll be monitoring the chat and compiling questions as we go along. Our first speaker is Dr. Jen Manley, a professor of neuropsychology in the Department of Neurology, the Gertrude H. Zergiewski Center, and the Taub Institute for Research on Alzheimer's Disease and the Aging Brain at Columbia University. Her research focuses on mechanisms of disparities in cognitive aging and Alzheimer's disease. Dr. Manley has received many impressive awards and recognitions for her path-breaking scholarship. She is a generous leader in the field through her work on numerous prominent advisory boards and scientific communities. I know her well enough to know that her generosity and vision extends to many less visible areas, with time spent and work completed when no one is looking. I also know her well enough that one of her greatest sources of pride is in her mentoring, for which she has also received multiple awards, including the Tony Wong Diversity Award for Outstanding Mentorship, and recently the Paul Satz Career Mentoring Award from the International Neuropsychological Society for her, and I quote here, extraordinary commitment to providing mentorship to future generations of neuropsychologists. Jen will be our first speaker, and I turn the floor over to you, Dr. Jen Manley.
Thank you. That was a really nice introduction, and you're spot on about what I'm most proud of, and that's why I think really excited that Justina is going to moderate our discussion today. And really excited to be on this panel of speakers. So what I want to do is, what we've been asked to do is hit some points on how our research should, potentially inform future research on aging in diverse populations. And I just want to share with you some lessons that I feel like I have learned in my my career of investigating why where there's a differential burden of dementia, cognitive impairment in older Black people and Latinx people. So let me go forward and say that I have no disclosures to report. I really want to thank the group of people who support this research. at the Taub Institute and the Sergievsky Center and NIA, who funds this research. Let me just give you the bottom line of my talk, really, as my first slide, which is that brain health research that's centered in equity, by definition, in my opinion, is community-based research and not clinic-based research. And so this really flips completely around what most Alzheimer's disease and cognitive aging research really has been up to this point, which is convenient samples and clinic-based samples. I'll try to convince you through some of the slides that I have and the talk that I prepared that this is really, the opposite of what we need at this point to understand not just disparities in brain health, but also what the best interventions are for maintaining healthy cognition as we get older. And so embedded in that approach, community-based approach, we first need to define our target community. Who is it that we're really interested in studying? And then at minimum, we should demand of our studies on older adult brain health a representative cohort. In some cases, and this includes the Health and Retirement Survey, even if you recruit a representative sample, you end up not having enough people to conduct analyses that have sufficient power to detect any differences in the patterns of the relationships you're looking at. So what that means is you've got to oversample, and that requires some planning ahead of time about how you're going to oversample and why you're going to oversample certain populations. I want to emphasize that some of this, embedded in this sampling idea is the importance of place. And I'll show you some data about how important place or region is for Alzheimer's disease and cognitive impairment. And then, a critical part, which really comes first, is that we have to repair our relationships with these communities because they're broken. I don't think that there's any better example of that than the way that vaccines were rolled out. And I'll admit, in my community, it was really bungled. And I think that all of us around the country, I'm talking to people in Texas, I don't really know the story there, but it's been difficult to see how disjointed and wrong-headed it has been. But this is the experience of minoritized populations with respect to healthcare all along. So there's a lot to repair before we can expect participation in our research studies, and that will require investment. I have begun to do that by supporting the unmet needs of people who participate in our research, and that was inspired by Lisa Barnes, who you're going to hear from later, and also from the start, really involving community research partners. Those community partners have taught me to design longitudinal research studies that put forward, at the forefront, public health relevant outcomes. And for dementia research, that's cognitive function. So a lot of studies talk about MRI scans and biomarkers for Alzheimer's disease. We know that there's a disconnect between some of these biomarkers for the disease and the actual experience of cognitive impairment. And so there's a lot of discussion that needs to take place with people about how we are tracking these biomarkers even in people with healthy cognition. And that's something that you can't do unless you're showing people what the most important outcome is. And in the case of Alzheimer's disease, and some people who do research on Alzheimer's disease forget this sometimes because they're really excited about preclinical biomarkers, but the most important outcome is cognitive impairment, being able to live independently, take care of yourself, and participate as an older person in society. So the community has also taught me to put as a primary goal to measure racially patterned exposures over the life course in concert with these biomarkers, that they must go together. I learned about my sort of emphasis on educational quality from the participants themselves. They also told me that racism was a major stressor for them, and that I needed to get a handle on that in my research. And finally, we were studying cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's disease in people aged 65 years and older in our community, you know, for a very long time. And the community members helped make it clear to us that starting at that age was way too late to actually understand the impact of social and other contextual factors on brain health. And so we began to study people in middle age, and I'll describe that study a little bit coming up. And then finally, you know, our team is very much of the community that we study. There's really no separation. The people on our team are the children and the grandchildren, and sometimes we've actually had conflicts of interest because someone's grandma is in the study. So they live there in the community that we study. And that's the only way that we can, you know, have trust with the community. And that means, you know, that the control and the engagement and the investment has to be of the community, and the leadership of the research team needs to be shared with the community. And I think, you know, there's a lot of talk these days, thank goodness, about clarification of how race and ethnicity are being used in our research. And I think in Alzheimer's disease, we have a very special problem. I guess it's not that special, but it's very annoying that race is being constantly reified as a biological variable in our research. And so we just have to be very vocal about that. And that requires, you know, some additional thought and research. So this is where I do most of my research in Washington Heights, Hamilton Heights, Inwood, Northern Manhattan, and more and more now the Bronx. Richard Mailloux began this study in 1992 of people who were Medicare eligible in the neighborhoods of Washington Heights and Inwood. We're about to get a renewal of this grant where Adam Brickman and I and Richard are MPIs of this project that has studied over 6,500 people that live around the hospital, the census tracts around the hospital. One key piece that I want to pass on to you in terms of lessons learned is that we do all of our evaluations in home, if that's what the participant wants, and also in offices that are really embedded in the community where people live. So they really don't have to go up to the university on the hill to get their evaluation, or to a different neighborhood. It's in their neighborhood. And so that's been a really critical piece to, you know, inclusion in the study. And I think that's, you know, a key part of inclusive aging research. We administer our neuropsychological battery. All of our testers and interviewers are fully bilingual in Spanish and English, and it's a longitudinal study. And the distribution of people in our study matches the census. I haven't checked out the newest census data. I don't know if it's available, I'm a little worried about it being accurate. But anyway, so far, our YCAP cohort matches the census in the neighborhoods that we're targeting. And that's what I mean by know your target. If you're targeting a group of people, you've got to have this, basis by which you're judging how you did in your recruitment or what it is that you need to do. So I just want to highlight a couple of research findings here of the YCAP study that we were able to show that I think are really super powerful, and I hope will encourage you to design similar studies maybe in other neighborhoods, which is that there is a secular difference in risk of cognitive decline and dementia because this YCAP study has taken place for over 25 years and recruited 3 different cohorts. Yet Vonk, who's one of the postdocs in the lab, was able to separate out people they were all studied at the same age, but we have people in the study who were born at an earlier cohort. And those folks who were born later, born after 1921, had less rapid decline in memory over time than people who were born prior to that age. So that all other things equal, just being born later was protective to your cognitive function, and yet found that this was entirely explained by a cohort or secular change in educational attainment, especially among African Americans. So we can trace this back to compulsory school laws in the South that and the North that increased minimum education time for this group. And here's Justina. I hope you weren't going to show your own research, because I'm going to show you research, which she looked at cognitive reserve using MRI imaging data along with neuropsychological test data to look at measures of neuropathology, such as cortical thickness, which is on the x-axis here for this slide, and performance on a language composite score. And so the key finding that Justina was able to find was that in white people, people with more education had high cognitive test scores, even when they had cortical thinning. But this was not the case among Black and Hispanic participants. In other words, years of school didn't have a uniform protective role across ethnic and racial groups. So another area of focus, really, as I have been saying, as I introduced, is who are we including in our research? And I just want to, remind, it's kind of tired now. It feels a little tired, but we are not trusted. We did not deserve that trust because of the things that our medical institutions have been doing and have, continued to do all along. It's not like one study, one historical marker. It's ongoing, the way that minoritized populations are treated in medical care. And I think what this does is it creates a huge bias when convenience samples are used. And I want to highlight one study that you may have seen by John Morris, who is in St. Louis, the Washington University of St. Louis. They did some Alzheimer's disease biomarkers in Black and white people. And, they found that even though in their hands, the Black people in their study had equivalent amounts of amyloid in their brain, they did a PET scan of that as compared to white people, the Black people in their study had less tau. And you can see here, it says cerebrospinal fluid tau. That means you get it from a lumbar puncture, which is pretty invasive, and very few people, are really gung-ho to get one of those, especially African Americans. And I think this study, I know the study had a very, long time to convince people to do it who are African American in that community. So, what we wonder now is if this, finding is really accurate, or whether it's representing some kind of ascertainment bias. In other words, are the African Americans who are getting through somehow have lower tau and CSF, not because they're equivalent to the white people in every other way, but because they're the ones who kind of were the first volunteers, kind of the folks who are coming up. So we have from this, and because they collected not that much information about the context of their target community, we don't even know how to reweight these data to see if they if they're biased and if the results change. In a follow-up paper, the same group did not replicate their results, that tau was lower in the non-Latinx Blacks. So now you're seeing like, okay, maybe they recruited a few more people. They didn't really explain why it was different, but they did add a neighborhood adversity index that explained differences between Black and white participants on measures of neurodegeneration or brain atrophy. It's really important to keep in mind that when you see these studies about neighborhood and racial and race, that racial residential segregation drives where Black and white people live. This is true in St. Louis. It's true in every city that I can think of. It's historically due to redlining. It continues on to this day. So the fact that neurodegeneration was associated with neighborhood characteristics does not mean, as the news was reporting at the time, that certain neighborhoods cause neurodegeneration. It could be that the same factor, racism, is driving, not just who participates in the study, but also where they live, and also may raise risk for cognitive impairment. I hope Lisa will show some of her data on that today. So I really love this paper. I would highly recommend it for anyone who's interested in Alzheimer's disease research. That basically ascertainment bias, highly selected cohorts may lead to misleading results. And Carrie Gleason basically showed that in the NAC data, which is a collaborative data from ADRCs around the country, selection-related factors totally account for the fact that Black people in the NAC database demonstrated a lower rate of progression in cognitive impairment over time than whites. And I hope, Lisa, we get a chance to discuss that some more today, maybe in our discussion. One example of sort of the differences in your results when you use a community-based cohort is from this YCAP study that was actually just published. It's not in press anymore. Adam Brickman looked at plasma amyloid and tau. So this is from blood, and found that our data agree with the Washington University ADRC's second study, that there's no differences in amyloid and tau across race. And we can talk more, maybe if we have time, about how terrible these ROC curves are. I can see Mark Hayward's face like, oh my God, don't show me that kind of ROC curve. Together, these plasma biomarkers, we think, are a critical component of understanding the overall burden of neuropathology in populations of people who are overburdened with disparities in Alzheimer's disease. And getting plasma biomarkers is great because you don't need to put people into an MRI scanner. Indira Turney has been looking at our offspring cohort. So one of the ideas that I mentioned before is that we need to include we needed to start earlier in age. So the idea here was to recruit the adult offspring of our YCAP participants. And we've begun to do that. Before COVID, we got 580 of them in the MRI scanner. And Indira was able to compare these imaging biomarkers across parent and children generation. Actually, in the sample, very few of the people who were scanned in YCAP, very few of them had children who were also scanned in offspring. So they're not really that related. But so the main difference here is that the offspring cohort were scanned, at an average age of about 20 years older than the offspring generation. And what you can see is that, there's the expected kind of age effect in whites on the white matter hyperintensity volume. So the parent generation have more white matter hyperintensities than the offspring. But this is not that big of a difference in the Black and Latinx groups, which is scary because, I'm 50. I'm going to be 55 in 5 years. And if my brain looks like somebody who's 75 years old, that sucks. And, and so it was really, we're thinking about, Indira's thinking about weathering to explain some of these data that, there's accelerated brain aging potentially in Black and Latinx people. And we'd like to, and we, how I said before, we started too late. We need to go even earlier because you're not born with these white matter hyperintensities. These develop over time and they're already there in the cohort of middle-aged African Americans. I don't think Mario will be surprised because of the cardiovascular disease load. So, I just want to say quickly in my last minute or so that we're thinking a lot about place. These data are from Maria Gleamore, who looked at death certificates and ones that were dementia was mentioned as a cause of death. The darker states are the ones where people who were born in those states were more likely to die of Alzheimer's disease or dementia. And you can see that the concentration is around the stroke belt. And this is where you were born, not where you died. So even people who migrated to the north took their risk with them. And what I want to show is that the Regard study actually oversampled people in the stroke belt and oversampled Black people. And this is what we need. This is what we need to determine where the risk is and oversample people in those areas. And so the Regard study has evolved as a study of dementia outcomes. And Maria Gleamore and I have been looking at policy, educational policy, because the Regard studies collected every place you've ever lived residential history information. We've been able to tie that to the county level investment in schooling in the states and in the counties where people lived. And those are highly disparate, as you can imagine, in the South, depending on race. And I'm showing you some data on teacher-student ratio and also length of school year. And what we found was that in the Regards cohort, we were able to include almost 20,000 people in this analysis. Higher investment in elementary school was associated with lower risk of cognitive impairment later in life. The effect was strongest in whites, especially white women. And you can note that the benefit of school quality was much lower among Black people, especially among Black men. And we think that racism throughout the life course in school and at work and throughout life is responsible for this, especially in Black men. In Project Talent, which is a school-based cohort that was studied in 1960, Nika Sablova, who's also a postdoc with our group, developed this composite of school quality variables from the administrators' reports of the schools in 1960 and found in this unadjusted model that school quality was associated with lower likelihood of reporting significant subjective cognitive complaints. This effect was not reliably different from zero when we added in covariates, but it was in the expected direction. And then stratified analyses found that the school quality effect was relatively stronger in whites than among Black and Hispanics in the unadjusted and the model adjusted for covariates. And finally, in a smaller subset, she found that where we assessed cognitive function over the phone, that people who attended higher quality schools had better cognitive scores overall. But when you break it down by race, that effect is largely driven by whites, but didn't hold up among Black people, such that higher school quality is not associated with better test scores among Black people. So I just want to end here to say I hope that I've shown you some of the evidence of how these contextual variables are related to dementia and cognitive impairment. And I think that the next steps are to track our progress in this area, build in accountability. We need to understand the influence of selection bias in our results. I give some suggestions there. If we're going to take part in population neuroscience or population dementia research, we have to have instruments to measure the most important outcomes, cognition, in large groups of people, in community-based settings, and also have population relevant biomarkers. And then I think that NIA and other institutions can help to build in incentives for diversifying cohorts, for creating environments, labs, and centers like CAPS, where scholars from minoritized backgrounds can thrive, and also providing additional resources for underrepresented scholars to thrive. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen.
Are you going to stop sharing, Jen?
I'm going to try. Oh, here it is. Yeah, I lost my little menu for a little while. Okay, there we go.
As a reminder for latecomers, we'll be taking questions and have a discussion at the end. So you're welcome to put your questions into the chat. Our next speaker is Dr. Lisa Barnes, the Alavi and Solomon Jesmer Professor of Gerontology and Geriatric Medicine at Rush University Alzheimer's Disease Center. She directs the Rush Center of Excellence on Disparities in HIV and Aging, where as a cognitive neuropsychologist, her work focuses on the epidemiology of aging and racial differences in chronic diseases of aging. Dr. Barnes is widely published and cited and has received numerous awards and international recognitions for her pioneering scholarly contributions and insights to minority aging and minority health. She is the principal investigator of 3 community-based cohort studies of older African Americans. A recent profile of her in The Lancet not only beautifully describes these contributions, but also gives a window into her unique approach that includes countless hours of work and engagement with communities. With this effort, she seeks to promote representation of Black individuals in research studies and build trust and understanding with communities for how research and science can improve lives. Thank you, Dr. Lisa Barnes, and I'll turn this over to you.
Thank you very much for that very nice introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be a part of this panel. I didn't know that anyone had seen the Lancet article. That's hilarious. And I wanted to thank Jen too for inviting me to be a part of this. Every time I hear her, I learn something new about how to think about this research that we're doing. So I'm going to offer a perspective from Chicago of how we are studying aging in minoritized populations. And so by way of background, I will just describe our community engagement philosophy and study design that we follow for. We have a number of cohort studies. I'm just going to show you data from the African American cohorts today. And I want to highlight some of the lessons that we've learned. You know, many of them really resonate with what you heard from Jen's talk. And they are just three basic things. We really try hard to work with the community as research partners and not on the community. You know, it's a subtle difference, but we look at our participants as actual partners guiding us in this research endeavor, and they're not our subjects or people that we are studying. The second key point I want to be able to convince you of is the importance of asking the right questions, especially when you're investigating cognitive aging in minoritized populations. And then the third lesson is to incorporate activities to sustain the work, because in the kind of work that we do, where we're following people over many years, and in our case in Chicago, we have a strong emphasis on obtaining brains, it's very important that we keep people engaged and in the study until death. And so we have, I'll show you some of the things we are doing to sort of sustain their engagement. And then I'll end with just some recommendations for doing this type of work with minoritized populations that I hope can apply to the populations you have in Texas. So you all know, what the issue is that we focus on in this area, and this, this disparity about African Americans being at a higher risk of Alzheimer's than their age match whites. They're about 2 times more likely to have the disease. They're also less likely to be diagnosed in a timely fashion, often getting a formal diagnosis, at a very severe stages, and they're 40% less likely to receive treatment. But there are challenges in interpreting this higher risk. And one of the challenges is the cognitive testing itself. The way that we make the diagnosis is heavily reliant on performance on neuropsychological tests. So, in our studies, people are given a comprehensive battery of tests that measure a number of different domains. And these, we know that cognitive function is often influenced by many factors outside of cognition itself. And I'm showing some of those on this little wheel here. And these factors also vary by race and ethnicity. So it really presents challenges when you're interpreting this greater risk, especially if you only see people at one point in time. So one way that we try to get around this challenge is to use longitudinal designs in which you examine a person repeatedly over time. And as you heard from Jen, this is a really strong approach in studying health disparities because it allows you to gain a reliable estimate of change in cognitive function over time. And if you think about it, we're studying aging. And so we're fundamentally interested in change over time, yet, most disparity studies don't measure that. Most disparity studies are cross-sectional snapshots. And so in our studies, we study people year after year so that we can identify risk factors, both genetic and environmental, and then determine the biologic pathways linking those risk factors to disease so that we can develop strategies to prevent Alzheimer's and other dementias, either by modifying lifestyle behaviors. So we might find that physical activity is a risk factor, and then we'll know that we need to educate people about increasing their physical activity. Or we could identify druggable targets to develop medications. What if we find that high blood pressure is a risk factor? Then we know if we treat the blood pressure, we may reduce the risk of dementia. So, but what do you need to do these kinds of studies? You need people without dementia, because you're trying to figure out what causes it. You need people who are recruited from the community and not the clinic, as you heard earlier. And we need people who will agree to annual testing, donation of blood for genetic testing. And in our case, we're very invested in getting their brain at the time of death, because we want to be able to understand the underlying biology of the cognitive impairment that we're seeing in our participants. So in our model, we use the first lesson that we've learned is that we have to have a model of community engagement. And when we work with people as partners, we use this approach called the engaged model of community engagement. And it is a consumer-centered education outreach model where the goal is to foster bi-directional relationships between the community and the researchers, and focuses on an integration of activities at multiple levels. So there are activities that take place at the community level, represented by the outer circle. So the initial activity always starts with networking with community and leaders, and stakeholders, and the community organizations. And these interactions provide insight on how to best give first. So that is what we do. We give first before we ask anything of the community. And then this community engagement leads to presentations educating the community about the value of research participation, because, as Jen noted, we're not trusted. And so sometimes we have to start at the very basic level, like what is research and why is it even important? And then this investment encourages recruitment and retention into specific research initiatives. But regardless of whether community members agree to participate in a specific research initiative, the cumulative knowledge from all of these initiatives are given back to the community for discussion and for determining new community networking opportunities. The last steps in the model involve evaluating our efforts with input from the community so that we can design, refine, or develop new questions, initiatives, and activities to retain our participants in our studies. So this is the model that we use, but it's not just a theoretical model. It is really grounded in real world, real life interactions with the community. And I'm just showing you a few examples of how it's not just our community engagement staff, which we have a very robust staff, doing these efforts. It's also the principal investigators who are out there. So I spend, especially when I first got funded, I spent 50% of my time in the community, giving presentations, giving, first, giving back, and really trying to build trust. And it's not something that you can outsource. If you are invested in working with minoritized communities, you have to be out there and you have to be, meeting people where they are. And that's what we try to do at the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center. And it's resulted in, 2 studies that I lead. One is called the Minority Aging Research Study that was initially funded in 2004. And when I first got funded, I only proposed to enroll 350 people that I would follow, over 5 years. And in the first 2 years, I enrolled, probably 250 people, because we had been in the community already, building those relationships, building trust, so that when I came back to them to get letters of interest for the study, it was really easy to do because I already had laid the foundation. And so now, in 2021, I was just refunded for years 16 to 20. We have about 800 African Americans. They start the study about 65 years and older. Sometimes you sneak in a little bit younger. They all have to have no known dementia or be taking medications for dementia. And they're recruited from the community, churches, senior buildings, organizations in Chicago that cater to older African Americans. And all of our testing is done in the home every year with the risk factor assessment and the blood draw. Our follow-up rate has been very good, over 90% among survivors. And since 2004, we have about 10% of the cohort has developed Alzheimer's dementia. And in 2011, after I felt like I had, gained trust and had built a solid relationship with the cohort, we started recruiting for brain autopsy. And so that is an ongoing endeavor that, has yielded, some brains, not a ton, but, it's a lot of work. And we're continuing that effort every day, really. The other study that I lead is the African American Clinical Core. Now we, have a federally funded Alzheimer's center that Jen talked about in her presentation, and every center is required to have a clinical core. And so in 2008, when I became the core leader, I transitioned that core to be all African American. Originally, that core was out of our clinic, our memory clinic, and it was a mix of, Blacks and whites, mostly with dementia. So I transitioned the core to be all African Americans who were recruited from the community, not the clinic. And the cohort consists of about over 350 people. It's about 98% African American, because we didn't get rid of everybody. We kind of like just, let them either drop out or they pass on. But they're, it's very similar to Mars. They're, 65 years and older. They're all African American, most of them, and they have no known dementia. Everything is the same as far as in-home testing. We have a harmonized cognitive battery. And, the only difference when you think about these two studies is that the core is really supposed to support like clinical trials and other sub-studies that come through our center. That's one of the charges of having a clinical core in the Alzheimer's Research Center. But importantly, I'm able to combine these because they have very it uses the same team, same cognitive battery. I can combine the studies to increase my sample size to look across. And this is especially important when I'm looking for a brain donation because those numbers are so low. So the study design that we follow is a typical longitudinal design with autopsy built into it. So we enroll everyone at baseline with no disease. And we document, all the risk factors we're interested in, and then we follow them over time every year so that we can associate the risk factors with change in cognitive performance over time, and then with incident disease, because everyone started out with no disease, and over time, people are going to develop mild cognitive impairment or Alzheimer's disease. So we can associate the risk factors with that. And then in those people who die and come to autopsy, we can associate the risk factors with a range of range of pathology measured in the brain, from no pathology to more severe pathology, all in the same study. Now, the second lesson that we've learned in doing this work is that you have to ask the right questions. And, for us, we try to include questions that are culturally relevant for the population we're studying, and in 2015, NIA put out a research framework that has been so helpful and, and sort of outlining the priority areas that we need to be looking at across a range of levels, and really, emphasizes taking a life course perspective when you're interested in disparities work and working with minoritized populations. Now, we have been doing, our work, since 2004, but this framework really helped us to solidify and identify new areas that we weren't really targeting that we could put more emphasis on. And so if you haven't seen this, I think everybody probably has by now, but it's really a great framework to sort of capture and use and leverage in your research. So in the next series of slides, I'm going to show you some data from our cohorts where we try to use this culturally relevant perspective. So in our study, we examined historical factors that shape older African Americans' lives. So, in starting in 1916 to about 1970, there was this, the Great Migration. I'm sure we all heard of it. It's estimated that some 6 million Black Southerners relocated to urban areas in the North and the West. And in our study, we just asked a simple question about where were you born and where were you living at age 12, with the thought that people, would have still been in school at age 12. And here I'm showing you data of performance on the cognitive function test in late life. We see people in 65 and older. And so higher scores represent better performance and negative are worse on our global cognitive measure. And what you can see is that people who are born in the South or living in the South at age 12 perform more poorly on the cognitive function test than those born in the North or living in the North at age 12. And these residential effects were only there for baseline. They did not predict change over time. Now, there's all kinds of differences between the South and the North. One of the things we know was different for African Americans at that time is the experience of educational segregation. So, the older African Americans that we're working with, they really represent the first generation to experience desegregated schooling after the Brown versus Board of Education ruling that ruled that racial segregation of children in public schools was unconstitutional. So we asked participants about their experience attending a segregated school in early life. And we did not find that segregation experience itself was associated with cognition, but we did find an interesting interaction with place of birth. such that those born in the South who attended a legally desegregated school had the lowest performance of all other groups. And I'm showing you in the circular, these are beta estimates from our linear regression model. You can see that those born in the South who attended a legally desegregated school performed worse than any other group, including Blacks born in the South who attended a legally segregated school. And we were surprised by this because, you know, it's been written that the segregated schools were, were inferior because they lacked essential resources, and, you know, and maybe the teacher quality may have been different. But what we think is that integrating schools in early life during that tumultuous time in history would have been a stressor for African-American children, and something that we can see 60 years later when we're testing their cognition. And this is consistent with, you know, the vast bulk of research in whites that shows the impact of early life adversity on late life cognition and other health factors. Now, discrimination is an important psychosocial stressor for African Americans, another type of stressor, and it has links to numerous adverse health outcomes. Some studies have found that it partially explains disparities in health. We were one of the earlier groups to look at discrimination with cognition in older adults. Most of the research, and this came out in 2013, most of the research prior to that had been done with other outcomes, and very few studies have focused on older adults. But if you think about it, this cohort of adults is the one you would expect to have, you know, outrageous experiences with discrimination, given Jim Crow and, you know, and all the things I've just talked about. And so we found that those people who reported more discrimination had worse performance on our cognitive function battery, both the global measure, but also in specific domains, including episodic memory and perceptual speed. And much of the association was explained by depressive symptoms. We've also looked at discrimination and its association with C-reactive protein, an inflammatory marker in the blood that reflects, you know, the level of inflammation in your blood. And we found that people who reported more discrimination had higher levels of CRP in their blood in a nice dose response fashion, suggesting a potential mechanism linking reports of discrimination to cognition and other poor health outcomes. But of course, we don't have to only look 60 years ago to examine the adverse effects of discrimination and racism. You know, the structural racism within our society has been amplified by recent events linked to police brutality, the coronavirus, and persistent poverty of Black and Brown people. And so we try to pick some of this up by, you know, using other constructs. So we have something called perceived stress, which I'm sure you are all aware of. It's the Cohen perceived stress scale. It's a measure that a 4-item scale that captures the degree to which a person finds their life uncontrollable, unpredictable, and overloading. And so in one study, we wanted to identify what are the correlates of perceived stress in older African Americans. And we found that, you know, higher depression and anxiety, having financial problems or a small social network or a low purpose in life and a small life space, those all increase or were associated with increased perceived stress. And then in a separate study, we found that those people who reported more perceived stress had a faster rate of cognitive decline in our studies compared to those who reported lower levels of perceived stress, as you can see in this slide. So the blue line are those at the highest part of the scale, the 90th percentile, compared to those who said they perceived very little stress in their lives. We also have started to look at another social construct called John Henryism. This was a scale developed by Sherman James, and you'll probably hear about this in Mario's talk. John Henryism is a strategy for coping with prolonged exposure to stressors like discrimination, and has been linked with higher cardiovascular disease, primarily in Black men. And so we looked to see if there's an association with cognition in our sample, and we found that there was an association. Higher reports of John Henryism was associated with lower cognition, an effect that was similar, that is similar in impact to having fewer years of education. And but it's not related to change in cognition, just where you start. So in my third and final lesson, I want to just, go through what I think some of the things that we have done to keep people engaged and retained in our study over time, because you have to incorporate these activities, especially if you're trying to get brains from older adults. It's not possible to just see them, every now and then. And so we do, all these things listed here. We have holiday drives, we have food and clothing drives, and a lot of these things were really brought to bear during the pandemic. We had to have PPE distribution, anything that our team could think about to keep people engaged, we were doing it. Let's talk webinars and social media events, and the back to school health fair. This is something that started before COVID. It's been going on, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 years now, but every year it gets bigger and better. It started out just on a storefront, and now we partner with the library, and it's in a South Side neighborhood called Inglewood. And we give out school supplies, and we have vendors there with all kinds of educational material. We have people doing screening, so it's not just focused on aging, it's really looking at the community at large, and and trying to give back and really show people that we care about their health and their aging. Because of the COVID, we've had to do a number of things virtually, so this just lists some of the programs that some of our sample programs for our virtual presentations, and we've had, it depends on, your access, obviously. So we are really working on, ways that we can improve and increase access so that more people can be involved with these types of things, but it's another way for us to stay engaged with the community. And one of the things that I'm really proud of is our team, they got together and they thought about, like, what could we do during COVID? And one of the things they came up with was this laundromat event where they decided to provide funding for essential workers, people who had to continue to work, even though, there was a pandemic and there was a shutdown. And so, they partnered with different laundromats throughout the city and had this, like, this time where people could come and wash their clothes for free and get free information about education, about healthy aging and Alzheimer's disease. And there was a lot of buy-in for things like this. And, and finally, I just want to say also, it's not just about us always giving information. It's also important to celebrate. You have to celebrate your participants. And right before COVID, the Mars study had a crystal celebration, the 15th year anniversary, where we had people come out and we gave them, we fed them. We had presentations from all the principal investigators that have sub-studies in Mars. And we had like a photo booth, and it was just a really fun time for people. And this just shows you the team that it took to put something like this together. And and it's because of this team that we even are able to do these kinds of things. They are just fantastic, and it's definitely a team effort. I want to really acknowledge all the hard work that they put in every single day. So in my last 2 slides, I want to wrap up and just share some key recommendations for working with diverse communities. And so these are at the level of the study. And a lot of these resonate with what you heard with Jen. So number one, we have to build relationships with the community to raise awareness. Still dementia is a stigmatized condition for older adults. So we have to do a lot to make sure we can remove that stigma. And that includes networking with leaders, creating culturally tailored educational programs. We have to also advocate for research participation. People are not just going to just sign up for your study because you say it's a nice thing. You have to provide education on the value of research and ensure them, that you're using informed consent. Their data is confidential. All those things we hear about, we have to make sure people know those things are not going to happen with us. And we do a lot to build trust. We don't disappear when the money runs out. So if we have a grant that isn't funded, we're still in the community. We use other funds to make sure we're able to stay in the community. We disseminate research findings back to the community. That's one complaint we always hear, that we take, and they never hear from us again. So we make sure they know what we're finding and how it relates to their life. And we seek input from them so that we can ask better questions. And we ensure workforce diversity at all levels, from the PI, all the way through. We make sure that the people working with the community look like the community. And then recommendations for at the level of the participant, we try to make participation easier by doing home visits. We do give backs. We pay for transportation if we have to have them do something outside of their home, like you go to the MRI center. We build relationships with participants by using culturally competent staff, like I say, from the same communities. And the investigators are known by participants. The staff will tell you that people have no problem emailing me or calling me to say, you know, I have a question, I have a concern. That's just like a common thing in our study. We maintain contact between yearly visits and, you know, by doing regular check-in calls, wellness check-ins, and greeting cards for special occasions. And we pay attention to the evolution of the study needs. So as time has gone on, we've seen that we have to incorporate things like social worker, retention specialists, and the family, because we're trying to get the brain. Who's going to call us at the time of death? We need the family member on board. So we're trying to, you know, always stay relevant and pay attention to the changing needs of the study. So I just want to acknowledge the funders of the work, the study participants who, you know, wouldn't have any of this without them. And of course, the staff of the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center and all of the faculty and key partners that I work with on these studies. And if anyone's interested in the data, we have a resource sharing hub with all kinds of data from omics all the way up to these social stressors. And we are happy to share data and work with you. So thank you for your attention.
And thank you, Dr. Lisa Barnes. Great. Our third speaker is Dr. Mario Sims, Associate Professor in the Department of Medicine at the University of Mississippi Medical Center. He's interim director and PI of the Jackson Heart Study, the largest single-site community-based epidemiologic investigation of environmental and genetic factors associated with cardiovascular disease among African Americans. His research focuses on understanding the social determinants of health disparities, with a specific interest in examining how racism, stress, and psychosocial factors, as well as traditional biomedical risk factors, combine to influence cardiovascular disease disparities between racial and ethnic groups. Years ago, I learned Dr. Sims received a KO1 award to work with data from the Jackson Heart Study, and he became a prolific and well-cited scholar. Most recently, before becoming the interim director, he served as chief science officer for the Jackson Heart Study. Welcome and thank you for speaking, Dr. Mario Sims.
All right, thank you very much for having me. Thanks, Jen, Chandra, for recommending me to speak to you all today. It's a pleasure. I'm not an aging researcher, but my research certainly has implications for aging in the minoritized population that we serve and study here in the Jackson Heart Study. I have no relationships to disclose. And what I want to do is, well, what I was asked to do is just to talk to you about what the Jackson Heart Study is and some justification as to why we exist, and to briefly mention some of the design elements of the Jackson Heart Study, and then talk to you about some of our research findings pointed to 4 dimensions of interest, which you can look at as 4 mechanisms that explain CVD inequities among African-American people. Then I'll wrap up with the conclusion. Okay, so this slide essentially shows the age-adjusted total cardiovascular disease mortality rates by race and ethnicity. And you see that over time between 2008 in 2018, there's been a decline in mortality per 100,000 adults across each ethnic and racial group. And it's clear that it's in a downward trend, but however, there still remains a disparity among African Americans compared to other groups, in that Black adults are 32% more likely to die of CVD. So something's going on with that. That's a popular statistic that we use and quote. So disparities exist, and we know it. and cardiovascular disease, particularly by measures of coronary heart disease, stroke, heart failure, and there are also disparities in cardiovascular disease risk factors, such as hypertension, type 2 diabetes, obesity behaviors. So you see similar patterns for ethnic and racial groups for these risk factor measures, as well as other factors. So clinical disease markers, brain health, as you just heard from Jen and Lisa's talks, but also behaviors as well, smoking, diet, and activity. And these factors are clearly on the pathway between exposure to social determinants or factors that impact disparities in cardiovascular disease. And so what I want to talk to you about are some of the non-traditional risk factors that impact cardiovascular disease, so what we call social determinants of health, and what role they actually play, and what we have found here in the Jackson Heart Study. So this slide, this map it always helps me to provide part justification of the Jackson Heart Study. It displays the intersection between social determinants of health and cardiovascular disease risk factors such as obesity, diabetes, heart disease, and cancer. And the top map shows the distribution, the geographic distribution of these cardiovascular disease risk factors, as well as one outcome. And the bottom map shows the geographic distribution of social determinants of health. So we see that areas that are high in poverty have high rates of heart disease. African-American people are more likely to live in high poverty areas, and people of color with higher concentrations of poor education, where there are high rates of cardiovascular disease. And then areas clearly with low poverty have lower rates of heart disease. Usually they're not populated by non-African-American people and are more likely to live in these non-poverty areas where there are lower rates of CVD. So there's a need to understand this multiplicity of socioeconomic and psychosocial factors that impact racial disparities in cardiovascular disease. And so findings in the literature have shown that, and you heard some of that in previous presentations, is that major factors that perceived discrimination found that, findings in the literature have found that it's associated with chronic conditions such as blood pressure, coronary artery calcification, which is a subclinical marker of CVD, and as well as health behaviors. And then in African Americans, discrimination has been found to be associated with blood pressure phenotypes such as systolic blood pressure, as well as blood pressure progression and incident hypertension. Along the socioeconomic realm, there's evidence that hypertension, diabetes, and obesity are patterned by socioeconomic status. That is, the higher you attain socioeconomic, the higher attainment of socioeconomic status protects you from a particular disease risk factor. And then along the psychosocial realm, I would say the negative affect realm, hostility has been found to be associated with markers such as incident hypertension among Black and white adults. This is found in the cardia cohort, and that depressive symptoms measured by the CESD score have been associated with CIMT, intermedial thickness, which is a marker for subclinical disease, but it's a small sample of Blacks and whites. And some of the implications of this work is that older people have reported lower discrimination, but higher BP, blood pressure. And that also older subjects have reported also lower SES. So there are implications to look at this sort of in an intersectional standpoint or a stratifying standpoint, also either by socioeconomic position as well as by aging. So what are some of the distinguishing features? Well, a lot of the previous studies are usually small and not really well characterized in terms of the amount of social determinants or psychosocial factors that are associated with health outcomes. So the Jackson Heart Study is a large cohort of African Americans. It's well characterized with psychosocial, which are some of these non-traditional measures, both negative affect and stress-related markers. It's a heterogeneous sample. Traditional samples we know are usually of lower socioeconomic status, but this, we have a bimodal distribution of educational attainment, as well as We have other measures of socioeconomic position, wealth, life course, socioeconomic position, and other measures. And also findings from the Jackson Hart study, it's an observational study, may help us to develop targeted interventions to eliminate disparities on a number of levels. So the Jackson Hart study is a study of cardiovascular disease among African-American people in the Jackson, Mississippi Tri-County area. It's a collaborative effort among 6 centers at 4 partner institutions. There are 3 centers at the University of Mississippi Medical Center. We house the Field Center, which administers the exam and has community engagement. It puts out a newsletter, have community events, and also the Coordinating Center, which coordinates the study, houses the steering committee and other subcommittees, as well as do a lot of the data cleaning and distribution to a lot of our partners, investigators, Vanguard centers, and working groups. We also have a graduate training and education center, which is unique to most studies. And the overall goal is of this graduate training and education center is to establish train graduate and medical students in the field of cardiovascular disease epidemiology. And, there's a series of didactic lectures, classes, mentorship, conference travel, database included to evaluate the metrics of the successes of the program. And in the Jackson State, it houses another graduate training and education center, which does has the same deliverables as the one from University of Mississippi Medical Center. Then there's an undergraduate training and education center, which is housed at Tougaloo, which also helps with diversifying the workforce with training future biomedical researchers, young African-American men and women who go on to medical school, public health programs, epidemiology, law school, biostatisticians. So it's very, very successful. And then we have one new center under this current contract, which is the Community Engagement Center, which implements strategies to address priority needs in the community. A lot of what you heard Lisa talk about is what was established from the ground up, to establishing relationships, gaining partners, key stakeholders, making community members partners at the table. They sit on our committees. We have regular events pre-COVID, but we've also tried to stay more engaged with them during this COVID era. But they're anxious to get back into the clinic for the administration of our next exam, which is great to hear, but we have to, proceed with caution. But also this Community Engagement Center, which is housed in the Mississippi State Department of Health. They're responsible for designating community health advisory networks to promote cardiovascular disease prevention in the community. They perform innovative small pilot community-based research projects that collect preliminary data to fund larger studies, prepare scientific manuscripts, work on white papers regarding key partners and stakeholders in the community's involvement with cardiovascular health promotion. We release lay summaries to them. So we let our participants know what we're finding, what we're studying, and what are the implications. But, they also want to know, what can they do to avoid a lot of the cardiovascular disease outcomes. So we're heading more into that, intervention era rather than just observing the actual population. So some of the primary goals of the Jackson Hart study include to broaden the research of cardiovascular risk factors among African-American people, increase access and participation of African-American adults, as well as people and underrepresented minority scientists in biomedical research and professions. Also to implement outreach activities to increase awareness and promote healthy, heart-healthy lifestyles in the community. So those are some of our key deliverables. And it is a contract, it isn't a grant. So, it's funded by NHLBI, National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. And the Jackson Hart study is a single site longitudinal cohort study of the risk factors and causes of CVD among African Americans between the ages of 35 and 84 years of age. I believe our oldest, and this was at baseline in year 2000. So our oldest participant is about 101, I believe. And we have a few of those in our sample. So talk about studying aging, healthy aging, et cetera, in our population. is ripe for the picking. We enrolled 5,306 African-American adults residing in the Tri-County area at baseline between 2000 and 2004. Clinic visits occurred between 2000 and 2013. So we've had 3 exams. We have annual follow-up interviews and cohort surveillance for hospitalizations due to cardiovascular disease, where we're adjudicating hard outcomes such as mortality, all-cause mortality, events for cardiovascular disease, stroke, heart failure, as well as heart disease. And the samples taken from an established Jackson site for Eric. And we also have a random component, a volunteer component, and a family study component, which we specific use for genetic studies. And we're starting to do more methylation, epigenetic, environmental, G by E kind of studies and the likes, a number of other studies. We also participate in a number of consortia, Top Med, PAGE, Gene by Lifestyle. So we're well involved with other cohorts doing pooled analysis as well as genetic studies. This is pretty much our catchment area. The lion's share of our participants are drawn from Hinds County, which is where Jackson, Mississippi is located. And you see that these are the other counties, Madison and Rankin County as well also have representation. This slide shows the timeline of our study, where we've had exams 1 to enroll participants. They're not patients. They always want to be called patients, but it's, you know, it's a research study. We have to remind them. It's a research study. We're not, you know, prescribing or treating. But we've had 3 exams, and we're in the process of preparing exam 4, which will start this summer. We're bringing in participants this summer, and that will start probably mid-July, something like that, and end in 2024. Then we'll have a closeout period. This is some of the surveillance that occurs. We call our participants once a year for annual follow-up. We're surveilling, surveillance for mortality, hospitalizations, heart failure, stroke. And these are some of the ancillary studies that have been a part of the Jackson Heart Study. So before I talk about some of the findings that we've put out in this area in the Jackson Heart Study, I want to show you some of the measures that we've collected along 4 different realms of social determinants. Socioeconomic status round, we've looked at, or we've measured individual and family income, education, occupation. We have childhood SES, which, you know, helps us to look at a life course perspective, job strain, psychosocial negative affect measures like depressive symptoms. We have stressors, global perceived stress, anger, hostility, job strain. Also, multiple dimensions of discrimination. We look at measures of everyday discrimination over the lifetime. And I'll talk about a little bit about some of these findings. What is that discrimination attributed to? It's attributed to one's race, gender, age, whatever. And we also measure contextual measures, data in the Jackson Heart Study, looking at neighborhood social cohesion disorder, residential segregation, the built environment. So there's plenty of work to be done. Some people think we're finished, but I truly say we're never really done, you know, especially when you talk about collecting data at baseline, but also over time to get more time series, time-varying approaches to a lot of explaining health inequities, which is what we're doing more of. So the 4 dimensions of interest I want to talk to you about as far as some of the findings, perceived discrimination, where we measure discrimination by everyday discrimination over one's lifetime. What are some of the factors that, you know, the participant associates with discrimination? We also measure burden of discrimination. How burdensome was discrimination for you, which captures another dimension of discrimination, not really found in the literature, and also the attribution. We also talk to you a little bit about some of our SCP, social factors research, socioeconomic status, and then some of our psychosocial risk factors, where we're well tooled in this area, where we have measures of stress, global stress, weekly stress inventory, and major life events, as well as depressive symptoms. Anger and anxiety is only measured in 1 ancillary study, so this probably shouldn't be here, but it's measured in 1 study. And we also measure hostility in the full cohort. But also another measure that we're starting to do more work in this area is measure of resilience or positive psychosocial well-being or resources, and markers that we measure such as optimism, religiosity, social networks. And I'll talk to you a little bit about what we're bringing into the new exam to add in this area of research. So I think that Jackson Heart Study is an ideal resource to examine how these factors impact cardiovascular disease disparities. And these mechanisms contribute clearly toward these health disparities and have implications for aging among African-American people, either healthy aging or deteriorative aging over time. Let's see. So among the realm of discrimination in cardiovascular disease, this is just one paper that we recently published late last year that looks at association of discrimination, dimensions of discrimination, excuse me, and hypertension risk. So usually studies that looked at, and I think a good point that Lisa made earlier is that usually a lot of this work have looked at these factors from a cross-sectional standpoint, but we were able to examine associations of everyday discrimination and incident hypertension, as well as examine lifetime discrimination and incident hypertension. And we found that there were associations, mainly among women, but not men. And that was among lifetime discrimination, the discrimination you experience over the lifetime. How does that impact getting hypertension over time? And we also found that stress associated with lifetime discrimination was associated with greater risk of hypertension. And this is after full adjustment as well. This is for the total population. Other work that we've done in the area of discrimination, cardiovascular disease risk factors. So this slide shows the work that we published over the last few years, where we looked at discrimination CVD risk factors as well as CVD risk. So our work has found that discrimination is positively associated with increased hypertension prevalence, subclinical disease, markers like left ventricular hypertrophy, carotid intermedial thickness, also health behaviors. Higher discrimination was associated with fewer hours of sleep and greater prevalence of smoking, as well as obesity. And one study in particular showed that everyday and lifetime discrimination were associated with reduced trust and satisfaction with one's healthcare provider. And that was in the fully adjusted model. So overall, we've shown that multiple dimensions of discrimination are important for considering cardiovascular disease disparities among African-American adults. Among the socioeconomic status and CVD realm, this one study, we examined life course socioeconomic status and hypertension. And here we found that essentially that higher childhood SES, and that's one's mother's, we also have father's education. Mother's education was associated with a lower prevalence and a greater risk of hypertension over time. We also looked at mobility. We found that upper mobility from childhood to adulthood SES along the measure of education, improving one's education over time, was associated with a lower incidence of hypertension, so that high socioeconomic status was protective of hypertension risk, which is consistent with what's been found in the literature. This one study looked at residential segregation and incident cardiovascular disease, work that's in preparation. So we see that the outcomes, incident CVD, stroke, and coronary heart disease along progressive adjustment here in the model with hazard ratios. So a standard deviation unit increase in residential segregation is associated with a 12% increase of hazard of CVD risk in model 1. But here you see that there's robust association for incident stroke over time, and no association was found for CHD. So we're able to look at measures beyond just individual level socioeconomic status, as well as subjective socioeconomic status, and look at place-based measures as well. And this is just some of the work that has shown that where we found that, markers like diabetes, chronic kidney disease, hypertension, subclinical disease are patterned by various measures of subjective, objective, and life course socioeconomic status. And overall, the consistent theme is that SES is protective of risk factors for heart disease among the sample of African-American adults. Along the realm of psychosocial factors and CVD, one recently published paper looked at striving for a better life and not seeing the desired result. This is a stressor and is also associated with heart disease. And so what we looked at is the extent to which goal-striving stress is associated with incident cardiovascular disease. And we examined this among men and women in the heart study, and we found that association between goal-striving stress and incident coronary heart disease was significant for the total sample in women in all models. No association was found for men, so that as goal-striving stress increased, the excuse me, the hazard for coronary heart disease increased, mainly for women, and it was not associated with incident heart failure. It was associated with lower risk and stroke among women after full adjustment. Okay. And this just shows that we found, we've looked at other measures of psychosocial factors and outcome measures such as blood pressure progression over time, reduced hours of sleep, increased smoking, and risk of stroke. We found that participants who reported high versus low financial stress, for example, had an increased risk of CHD after full adjustment. That's in the paper here, in the Morgan paper. And so this work shows that non-traditional factors are important to mention in considering CVD inequities. Among the final dimension of social determinants, that we're starting to look at some of the positive psychological factors and cardiovascular health. In this paper, we examined, published about a few years ago, examined the measure optimism. It's associated with coronary cardiovascular health as measured by the American Heart Association's Life Simple 7 metrics. So we found that higher optimism was associated with greater prevalence of ideal smoking, and that's usually those who do not smoke. And this is all cross-sectional, as well as ideal physical activity. And we also found that that there was association that was modified by age, and that participants greater than or equal to 55 years of age who reported high versus low optimism had a greater prevalence of ideal blood pressure and the composite Life Simple 7 measure, which combines health measures as well as clinical measures after full adjustment. Okay. So this points to further study a matter of healthy aging that should be examined even more with more longitudinal analysis. This is only cross-sectional analysis, which would point you more into more of a dynamic process. And here are just a few other papers that we've looked at that have examined some of the psychosocial resource measures or resilience factors that have looked at other measures like chronic kidney disease, rapid kidney function decline. We found association with higher optimism is protective or inversely associated with those measures. And that also we found that optimism was associated with decline in all-cause mortality. It was association was stronger among those with higher income and among men. So that paper is in progress now. In upcoming work in this realm, we're looking at optimism and changes in Life Simple 7 measures, resilience and allostatic load, healthy aging and cardiovascular disease measures. These are some of the measures that we'll implement into exam 4, which, as I mentioned earlier, will be starting this summer. Some of the same psychosocial measures we're bringing back. We're also measuring chronic burden, which you measured at exam 3, hostility and chronic stress. But some of the psychosocial well-being measures, we're looking at life satisfaction, optimism again, purpose in life, positive and negative affect schedule, as well as a brief resilience, 6-item brief resilience scale. And this will allow us to measure some time varying studies with resilience measures, as well as cardiovascular disease risk. And we're also working with Lisa and Jen's working group, it's a healthy aging working group, to look at measures of resilience and brain health, discrimination, stress, and dementia, as well as discrimination and cognition among African American people. So there's a lot to be done, a lot of untapped areas. So in summary, we know that we found that in a lot of our work that psychosocial factors and measures of discrimination are associated with cardiovascular disease risk factors. The novelty for us is that it's measured from a multi-dimensional standpoint, which is not done as well in the literature among such a large sample of African American adults. We found that socioeconomic status or CVD is patterned by socioeconomic status, which could be, a buffer or protective of CVD risk factors. The novelty of this area is that we have other measures of socioeconomic positioning, like area-based measures, residential segregation. We're going to look at some residential history measures in our upcoming exam. We have measures of wealth, also measures of authority, job strain. So there's a lot to be done there. And number 3, resilience is protective of cardiovascular disease risk factors, which some of the early cross-sectional studies have shown, and as well as predictive of cardiovascular health. So the novelty is that this has not been done in such a large sample of African American. And so the approaches that consider these multi-level components of inequities, I think it's a chance to provide some understanding of positive well-being and CVD risk reduction, and it points us in a direction of more targeted intervention preventions that we could start to explore as ancillary studies in the Jackson Heart study. So I think the best practices for studying minoritized populations is, from our perspective, is to consider multiple domains, which is sort of a common theme I've heard through the 2 previous talks. Multiple domains, like domains of discrimination, social class and well-being, psychosocial risk and well-being, as well as resilience. And I think these measures of social determinants will be able to show their impact on health inequities, and which some of our studies are showing may be modified by major confounders such as aging. And so what could be said toward the end as well is that psychosocial stressors are associated with CVD, which has implications for deteriorative aging, and psychosocial resources are predictive of cardiovascular health by measures of Life Simple 7, which has implications for healthy aging. I mean, what does it look like for blood pressure over time? It's those who report higher levels of resilience at baseline. How does that contribute toward systolic changes in systolic, diastolic blood pressure over time, as well as cognition? So we'll be able to do that. But less is known about this in a multidimensional framework. And also less is known about the intersectionality of these factors and how they synergistically contribute to inequities that inform aging among African American people. I think we have a golden opportunity to do that, not only in the Jackson Heart study, but also combining other studies, like Jen mentioned the REGARD study, doing pooled analysis, the Hispanic Soul study, so we can look at it across a full range of minoritized cohort studies. And I think, yes, that's it. Okay, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Before we open it up for questions, Dr. Justina Avila-Rieger is our moderator and discussant. She'll say a few words. She is a postdoctoral research scientist in neurology at the Gertrude H. Sergeyevsky Center and the Taub Institute for Research in Aging and Alzheimer's Disease at Columbia University. She completed her doctoral degree in clinical psychology with an emphasis on neuropsychology and quantitative methodology, the University of New Mexico, and her clinical internship in neuropsychology at the Baltimore VA Medical Center. During her graduate training, she specialized in health policy as a Robert Wood Johnson Health Policy Research Fellow. Her research focuses on variability in sex, gender inequalities, and cognitive decline and dementia risk across race and ethnicity, place, and time. Her overall goal as a researcher is to give a voice to the communities that are traditionally marginalized in sex, gender, cognitive aging research, In her own work, she does this by emphasizing the life course experiences of women of color and how these experiences shape biological mechanisms that ultimately lead to gender, sex inequalities, and late life cognitive health. And Justina, I'll be turning this over to you, and then you will segue also to moderating and the Q&A and discussion. Thank you for agreeing to do this.
Of course, thank you. Excellent presentations, and I'm extremely honored to be moderating this panel. And yeah, so before we get into audience questions, I wanted to make very brief remarks and ask each of our panelists one question, and I'm hoping that each of you can give no more than a 2-minute response to these questions so we can get to audience questions. So I personally am really interested in health policy and how to turn all of this disparities research into sound policy that can directly influence the lives of our aging populations. And if you look at our current aging health policies or policies for ADRD, most of them focus on caregiver support or early diagnosis of dementia, but there really isn't much in terms of prevention for aging disparities. And in addressing these social determinants, which are the root causes of these aging disparities, has yet to be integrated into a policy agenda. And so I'm wondering what each of your thoughts are about how we as researchers can move the needle on these health policy agendas. Because, you know, if our research isn't changing lives, then what's really the point of what we're doing? And I really believe that it's important to think of policy implications of our works in all stages of the research process. So something I'm hoping that we can touch on broadly as I ask each of you specific questions is, what role should researchers play in influencing the development of health policy that targets these social structural determinants of aging inequalities that you all were talking about? And how are these roles incorporated into our research approaches? And so, Dr. Barnes, this first question is for you. So I'm thinking about the role of the community and cohorts that we're working with. And I really liked how you started off your presentation by saying that, you know, we work with the community as a partnership and not on the community. And you discussed your community engagement approach, which I thought was just a really awesome framework. And I'm so impressed with the level of engagement that your team has with the community in so many different ways. And so I'm wondering what role this approach might play in influencing policies or initiatives to actually improve brain health within the community. And then for those who maybe don't yet have partnerships with community-based cohorts, what might be some opportunities to leverage other resources and or other data sets to be able to do this type of work?
Thank you, Justina. That's a long question.
Sorry.
So the first part about how to have the role of the community engagement model inform health policy. You know, I think that the work that we do with these minoritized communities, it has to have implications for policy. I know that as researchers, I didn't go into this thinking that that was going to be what my role would be, but I just think it's the most ethical thing, especially when we're looking at disparities and the fact that minoritized populations are more at risk. And so, I think the thing that I'm learning as I'm doing this work is that it's going to take us being at the table with these policymakers, right? Because, they may not be reading our work and I might not be reading their work. So it's going to take us working together. So when I get invitations to speak at different places, sometimes it could be some policymakers at the table, right? So how do I make my research findings more relevant to the things that they're thinking about? And I think, for instance, like the findings about segregation experience and the impact that has on late life health outcomes, that has huge implications for policies now with education, right? We know today that even though schools are not legally segregated, they still end up being segregated, right? You know, with residential segregation and redlining and things like that. So I think being able to tie the work that we do to policy is something that we all have to do as a responsibility as health disparities researchers. And what was the second part of your question?
That's okay. I think what you said was perfect.
Okay.
And maybe I can follow up with that question later, but thank you so much. Okay, so Dr. Sims, my next question is for you. So currently, some ADRD initiatives to lower ADRD disparities and also just prevalence, they include health behavior strategies to reduce cardiovascular disease risk factors. But as you discussed in your presentation, there are several social determinants underlying cardiovascular risk that need to be addressed. And I think that what you presented on is an excellent example of the type of work that we can be doing that can have these direct policy implications to develop initiatives that can lower cardiovascular risk by addressing these social determinants. And so one question I'm wondering how you decided on the specific social determinants of health constructs and measures that you talked about, and if you have any insight into how we should be thinking about measure selection when it comes to this.
Thank you for the question. That's a good question. So a lot of the initial baseline social determinants measures were decided on before I actually got here, before I was hired. So that was probably early 1990s into the 2000s. But what was done is that there were working groups assembled. We had consultants involved, national experts, people like David Williams at the table, Anna Diaz-Rue, Sherman James. So a lot of noted scholars who had published in these areas allowed Jackson Heart Study at that time to put together a draft and surveys where they pilot tested a lot of what was going on or what they had an interest in doing. And so I think eventually a lot of those factors made the cut. Now, keep in mind, this is a cardiovascular disease study. So the primary phenotypes that NHWI wants are things like heart failure, CVD events, subclinical disease, and we understand that, medication history, high blood pressure, diabetes, but they also understand that social determinants are very key players or exposure factors that impact health inequities, which is why Jackson Heart Study was created and kind of branched off from the ARIC site, which is the atherosclerosis risk in community study. So that's what they were really interested in doing. So they knew that there had to be a marriage between these two, social determinants, explaining a lot of these cardiovascular disease risk phenotypes and measures and things like that. So that's how, a lot of that came into play. Like we decided what measures were, but moving forward, I do have more of a say or a weigh in what measures are going to be added, excuse me, as far as social determinants in future exams. We bring the same type of system that was brought early on to our working group. I co-chair the Social Determinants of Health Working Group. So we'll have discussions. We met with the experts, get their way in and do the same process moving forward. So.
Thank you. And then Dr. Manley, this question is for you. So towards the end of your talk, you discussed the importance of place. And something that you and I have both been really interested in is early life quality of education, and it's linked to late life cognitive health outcomes. And you talked about the project that you've done in regards looking at county level investment in schooling. And we've also done something similar in YCAP, looking at state level investment in schooling and showing a link between dementia risk. And these state level and county level findings, it seems like they can be easily translated into actual policy. But I'm wondering, how do we get people like policymakers invested in something that happened so early in one's life when the outcome is so much later in life? Like how do we get these types of things incorporated into Alzheimer's disease policy?
I don't know. I don't know the answer.
For you.
You asked me the hardest question. I was going to say, you are my postdoc. You cannot ask me the hardest question of all of them. No, I mean, I think that you actually have given me a window into maybe how to get started, which is that, you know, we're already, and kind of in a horrible way, COVID sort of did too, which is that we, as I described the YCAPS and offspring studies, we have been in these communities independent of the medical care that they get at the hospital. So we didn't define these populations because they use the hospital in any way. We define them because they live around that neighborhood. And then came COVID, so we really got to see sort of in a really up close way how the hospital now plays out its relationships with the community that we already had access to. And sort of what happened with the vaccine was we knew how to reach the older people who live around the hospital, but the hospital did not actually roll out the vaccine in that way at all. If they had come to our study coordinators to ask us, how should we sort of speak with and reach the older adult community in order to get them vaccinated, we would have had the answers, which in a way was heartening, but it was also extremely, you know, frustrating that that wasn't how it happened. So, you know, like I just think that the approaches that I went over in my talk are the first step to creating a partnership that actually can inform policy. So, you know, and you've taught me that there are, you know, ways to sort of, you know, get that into you know, grassroots engagement. So my thought is, you know, I don't know who, I guess we do know who the representative is in, you know, in the neighborhood around the hospital, but they have other worries and they have other priorities. Their priorities will probably match ours if we can, you know, invest in the community and partner with them on, you know, on brain health prevention or brain illness prevention measures. So, so yeah, I think that the engagement is the first step, and you know, I think that when we get together with the community in our community events, the kind of changes that we want to make as a community bubble up to the surface. It's a natural progression of that discussion. And so I'm excited about getting back to that, you know, now that more and more people are getting vaccinated and we can be with them in person again.
Thank you. Really great response.
Yeah. Can I just ask Jen something?
Yes, please.
I didn't know about the vaccine example. I think that's a really excellent example of how your study could be a foundation to move things in the right direction. Do you know of anything beyond aging, how research may have impacted policy? The only thing I can think of is like the example of lead, right? Like we knew about the effects of lead and it was taken out of whatever, the pencils, the paint and all of that. But I don't know what led to that kind of a movement, if it was based on research or what. Do you know of any kind of research beyond aging where something like that has happened?
I mean, this is kind of maybe a silly example, but industrial organizational psychology really claims that their science created the way that the brake lights on cars, this is so ridiculous because I don't even have a car, but you know, the brake lights on cars, they actually you know, are up at the level of the eye, so you can see when a car in front of you is braking. And their whole, you know, science really brought that to the car manufacturers to prevent accidents. I mean, that's not aging. That's barely even. I mean, it's health because, you know, people get injured. But the other thing I wanted to say is that you know, through another opportunity that some of our lab members had with Robert Fullylove, who runs a race and health class, they've been thinking a lot, and this really came to the fore for all of us, Lisa, and Mario, for the pandemic, that a lot of the older adults who we work with do not have access to the internet at all. And so they've been, you know, gearing up with a bunch of organizations. I think it's called like Silicon Harlem, that provide broadband access to neighborhoods without it in New York City. And so, I mean, that's sort of like, you know, I don't think I would call that policy necessarily, but those sorts of initiatives, I think, are the kinds of things that get the attention of you know, should get the attention of policymakers. And then, you know, Columbia University is a major financial power in this neighborhood. Just, you know, the whole west side of Manhattan, from 116th Street, you know, around to 168th Street. Now, because of the expansion of the campus, like that's all Columbia. And the people who live around there are employed by the university, many of them. And, you know, their children, as they graduate from high school and college, potentially are seeking jobs in that at Columbia. So I also want to link, you know, the funding for the research that we do to the well-being of the community that we're in, as long as we're connected and remain connected. Like, that's an explicit way in which research can actually benefit the community, as long as we're not privileging whiteness or privileging suburban, you know, residents and all that, because the people who live around where Columbia is are not those things. And in fact, they have a voice that really needs to be represented in this research. And I found that I couldn't do this research without that voice. So that's another kind of policy that I have that I think should be a requirement, right, of universities and of research studies.
Thank you.
And going off of that, Dr. Manley, I think as one of the questions I also wanted to pose to you all was, you know, not everyone has doesn't yet have access to these community-based cohorts. And you know, as Dr. Barnes and Manley were talking about, it takes a long time to build these relationships. And so I think in the meantime, you know, what can people do to contribute in a way? And I think that you know, bringing people in from the community to work on these research teams is a really good opportunity as well. But do any of you have any other advice about other cohorts or things you can leverage to get this going if you don't yet have access to community-based cohorts? And then I will open it up to audience questions.
Well, I guess Justina, I don't think this is the answer to the question that you asked, but I will say that I put in the chat, and so did Dr. Sims put in the chat, resources for people to access the Jackson Heart study data. There's a data request process for the YCAP data. All of you know you can go and get the health and retirement study data. And also I see Rebecca Wong is here, so you can get data from the Mexican Health and Aging Study on their website. I mean, these are incredible samples with a good deal of, you just heard the description of all the data that are available. Contact us if you want to use that. And then, I think that's probably realistically for a lot of the early career scholars, as opposed to starting your own cohort. I think that combined with perhaps identifying some community-based advisors as a part of your mentorship team, is probably a good place to start.
That's perfect. That answered my question.
And I would just echo that too, that, my studies are, obviously more volunteer based, so they don't, compare to YCAP and Jackson Heart. But, we have very deep phenotyping in our cohorts, something that's, large population-based studies, are not always able to do. But also we have a population-based study called the Chicago Health and Aging Project at Rush. And, that is a cohort of Blacks and whites, over 10,000 people who've been followed for 18 years. They also have an offspring study for that too, as well. And so, we are very collaborative at Rush, and I'm so happy and open to working with young investigators on any of the data that we have at Rush. So people can just reach out to me as well.
Anyone from the audience? I am checking and no questions have been posted, but if someone wants to jump in, raise your hand or just jump in and ask a question.
Mark. Oh, it's possible you need permission to unmute. Is that right? No, okay.
There we go. These were great talks, and they kind of reminded me of too many things, so I will try to keep my thoughts short. So I thought about the Livingston paper published in the Lancet in terms of the life course factors influencing dementia, cognitive aging. And one of the things that seems when we look at the Lancet paper, they begin to say, well, education affects 8% of dementia compared to smoking, compared to physical activity, compared to whatever. And one of the things that strikes me was when we look at studies like that, it's so reified, and it doesn't take into account that different groups have different kinds of exposures and different behaviors. And so the factors that come into play are really quite varied when you think about what influences risk among one population group or among another. But it goes back to Justina's issue about policy, because different policies that are affecting different life course exposures, whether they're intended to be for dementia or not, or heart disease, are going to have some real consequences, whether they be for physical activity or education or or smoking or whatever have you. So I just thought I would throw in there. But my real question is, so you look at, we have looked at things like what Mario was looking at in terms of socioeconomic conditions and kinds of education and things like that influence dementia risk over time. And one of the surprising things to us, at least using the HRS data, is that we don't have what I would say is any kind of disease pathway that goes through, like say, hypertension and stroke to dementia risk. It's not that these diseases aren't related to dementia risk. They are, but they're not pathways between like race and SES and dementia risk. I was wondering if you had found things similar in your own work and whether you had any thoughts about what those kinds of associations.
I find the same thing, that even after sort of taking into account any kind of mediation through those diseases, there's still this disparity. And I think that we need to think more broadly about, and I think that's why longitudinal cognitive data is so important, because a lot of these factors really impact intercept, sort of the cognitive function that you're coming to aging with, as opposed to decline over time or rate of decline. And I think that has some implications for the biological mechanisms. I think we need better and more biomarkers too, like, I talked about the biological aging piece. I'm super excited about that because I think it, even though it's broad, it's getting at some sort of more general overall potential biological, accelerated aging mechanisms, and then inflammatory mechanisms too, that are independent of the traditional kind of, or, subclinical to the traditional cerebrovascular disease.
Well, we are actually a little past time, and it's not like a conference where the next group is coming into the room, I guess, but we probably do want to wrap up. And I can't thank all three speakers and the moderator enough for a very, very enlightening panel.